Should we introduce ourselves?
Oh, yes. You're so good at doing that. Okay. Yes. Let's introduce ourselves. Okay. So I'm Heddy Ben-Atar.
And I'm Doron Ben-Atar. And
Okay.
this is
Life, History, and Everyday Bullshtick. It is our father-daughter podcast about
history and current events. And the best part of it is the lifetime advice.
Abba. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. We just returned from Israel and we spent a lot of time together. But the most wonderful thing was getting to see Michali and Yoni, your cousins, and to see their families and to be reminded how much I love them. And it's great. It was really, really great. We're so lucky that Yoni is alive. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
You think about the hostages all the time, and I think about how close he was to being taken as a hostage or to everybody to be murdered, and how they survived. It's amazing. What was
Yeah.
your impression?
Well, we did a tour of Kibbutz Nir Oz, which was, as he described it, captured on October 7th. And we being you and me. And my impression was similar, that it's so scary how close he was. And
His
it's
kids and his
mhm.
wife and his, his sister-in-law and brother-in-law and his in-law. I mean, unbelievable. They how can they have survived this? Unbelievable.
Yeah. My impression was walking into the kibbutz, I just had this assumption that the reason they were alive essentially was because they were too inside the kibbutz, and maybe they were further back than the first line or
Right.
whatnot.
Could be.
And then you get there and you're standing at their house, and it's like, okay, but the people right across the street, a little bit more into the kibbutz, they were kidnapped, and the house next door was burned down. So it was just some assumptions that I had about why they were lucky enough to survive were just kind of really disproven by being around there.
There's no rhyme or reason to it.
Yeah.
Wasn't there a family murder just in the house nearby or something next to them?
Yes.
Something.
Yes. Yes. A full
Parents
family
and
with
3
kids.
small children. Yeah.
Yes.
All right.
It was awful. It was awful.
It was awful, but it was important for us to be there to remember that we have a personal stake in this story. That this is not for us a political obstruction. That this is not a debate who's right and who's wrong for us, but it's about our family, about us. All right.
Okay, so we're going to try and talk about something happening very current right now. We're recording on Wednesday, January 8th at 6:45 p.m. And what's been on my mind today is the news about the Los Angeles area wildfires. What we know so far is that there are 3 wildfires around the city of Los Angeles. Many people have lost their homes and have been evacuated. And it's clearly tragic and upsetting. And it made me think a little bit about if you had any ideas of a few examples of fires in history that feel relevant to today. So I wanted to ask you, what fires do you think of?
So the first thing that I want to say about fires is that they're devastating, they're deadly, but they're often a new chapter for growth and innovation. And while fire seems to be a destructive force for human beings, it's actually a building block of civilization. So the first famous fire that comes to mind to every historian is the Great Fire of Rome in the year of 64 of the Common Era. Rome, as you know, by the first century, dominated the entire Mediterranean world, and and the city of Rome itself was densely populated, and it was ruled by emperors from the Caesar family, from Julius Caesar's family. The fire in Rome in the year 64 is quite symbolic, because it's not that it consumed 10 out of 14, I think, districts of the city, or the devastation, but rather for its symbolic meaning. First of all, the fire was blamed by some commentators on Nero himself. Nero was the Roman emperor from the Caesar family, from Augustus Caesar line, and he was known as spoiled, corrupt, and the rumor spread that he set the fire himself in order to build, a playing, a building project, of some sort, some palace. And it sort of stood for his corruption, and the corruption of the Caesar family itself. So what happened is that, and then there is the legend of Nero playing the lyre as Rome is burning, and it's a very famous image. It appears in many books. Both of those things are probably mythological, because, first of all, Nero himself was not in Rome when the fire started. He was at a different estate. Though, of course, he could have had somebody set the fire for him, but he wasn't there. And there is no evidence that he ever played the lyre sort of joyfully as the city burned. It's like, but what
lyre,
it does is...
You mean lyre or whatever,
lyre.
like a musical instrument?
Lyre. Lyre, I'm sorry.
Isn't that
English
what
is
it's
a very...
called?
Yes, lyre. I apologize. Could you please tell our listeners that I'm a foreigner?
Yeah.
The lyre. It's a lyre. And so... And so there's no evidence of that, but the image persisted. And why did it persist? It persisted because Rome, Nero was corrupt. He was hedonistic. He was known to womanize and to really be consumed with his own pleasure and not to care about the people. And so the fire represented the kind of the final discrediting of the Caesar family, and indeed Nero would soon after be toppled, and there will be a new line of emperors that would succeed the Caesar family. It will begin the kind of story of Roman emperors coming from different families after different coups and stuff like that, which would last well into the end of the Roman Empire. So the second thing about that fire that's so important is for the history of Christianity. Christians in the first century Rome were a strange Jewish sect. I mean, they were not, who knows how many were there actually, and they had different customs. I mean, there were Jews in Rome, but the Jews have been in Rome well before. And the Christians were the new sect, and Nero, to deflect the focus from him, blamed the Christians, which led to the first really major persecution of the Christians. And this Christian tradition of martyrdom that would be central to Christian culture as it evolved in the first millennium.
Do we know what caused the Rome fire if it wasn't?
There's always the theory of an arson, somebody who
Who did it
who
on purpose?
did it, but I don't think it's an arson. Um, the houses were um, built from wood. The streets were very, very narrow, and um, and and it's about the wind, just like in Los Angeles today. The fire of '64 in Rome did not devastate the empire at all. Did not devastate Rome. On the contrary, Rome was rebuilt. It was rebuilt a bigger, stronger, and this catastrophe that seemed to devastate Rome uh, turned out to have been a way to start again. And that's the thing about fires. Very often human beings build something that accommodates needs of a particular moment. But then the needs change, but the structures that we built to address these needs are there. And people live there, and you can't do anything about it. What the fire allows you to do is to completely rebuild, to start from scratch. It is often a new chapter.
So the first fire you think of is this fire in Rome in 64, which is in the city of Rome, where much of the city was kind of burned to the ground. We don't know where it started, but the reason you feel like it's so significant is it's one of the earliest historical records of a fire, I guess, or of a major city
Of
fire.
a huge fire. I mean, Rome is the capital of the world. I mean, there were fires. Fires. Every city and every town had fires. It's a common thing. The assumption that we will not have fire is a faulty human assumption.
So just going back to it, the first fire that you think of is this fire in Rome in 64. And part of what happens is it burns down a lot of the city. And the other part of what happens is historically, there's a lot of discussion about who is to blame. What does the fire cause? You talked a bit about how the fire causes rebuilding, but also it caused the fall of the Caesar dynasty. And
how about not cause? I think the word cause is too strong here, Heddy.
Okay.
I think it's more symbolizes.
Okay, tell me why.
Because the fire, Nero remains emperor after the fire. It's that the fire kind of represents his corruption.
Okay. And then similarly, that it's also significant in that it starts increased persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire, essentially.
Right.
Okay. Okay. What is another example of a significant fire that you think of?
So there are, the next one, as an early Americanist, I have to take you to not a fire in the United States, but to the Great Fire of London of 1666.
Oh, okay.
And the story here is in 1665, there was a terrible plague in London that killed a significant portion of the population. And in 1666, a terrible fire consumed much of London and left 70 to 80,000 people homeless. And as an American historian, the fire has a kind of symbolic importance. The greatest issue in American history, as we all know, continued to be is slavery. The original sin of English colonization of America. And what historians have pointed out is that while African slaves appear in Virginia as early as 1619, slavery as an institution does not take root in the colony until well into the end of the 17th century, because the primary source of labor was indentured servants. White indentured servants would trade to go to Virginia some years of work, and that was the labor force that really built early Virginia. Why was it a successful idea to use white workers over slaves? Because slaves are already used in the West Indies. And the answer is that life expectancy in Virginia was very, very short.
Hmm.
And so if you bring an indentured servant and he dies shortly after into his indenture, and the terms of indenture varied. People say 7 years, but it was more like 4 years or so. Then you haven't lost anything in the process. Whereas if you buy a slave and you and the slave died, you lost your investment. I know it sounds horrible and cruel to talk about human beings like that, but we have to. And so the other element of it was that in the 16th and 17th century England, what we have is massive population growth and the movement away from farmland to cities of the urban poor, because peasants lost their ground as aristocrats started to define their property. It used to be that there was kind of a relationship between the landlord or the aristocrat and the peasant, which allowed them to stay and allowed them sort of to roam, and the property was not marked very clearly. But as properties became to be marked more clearly in something called enclosures, many people who lived on land that they did not have supposed a right to it had to leave, and they moved to the cities where they really become impoverished, urban poor, associated with crime and with alcoholism. And there was this concern in England that we will be what we would do with these people, with this quote unquote urban poor. And so the solution that seemed to have worked was that, hey, let's ship those urban poor to the colonies, primarily to Virginia. And in the colonies, they will become productive citizens. They will not burden the public purse with, because charity was something that every community tried to avoid. And that will solve our problem of overpopulation. And indeed, Virginia is built by these indentured servants. Many of them are the landless urban poor. After the mid 17th century, fewer indentured servants are coming from England. Why fewer are coming? And the answer that some historians give is that fewer are coming because the urban poor are finding more employment in England or other opportunities, or they move to other colonies that are not as deadly as Virginia. I mean, Virginia was a death trap. It's a so the Great Fire of London consumed so much of London, combined with the plague that preceded it. This notion of surplus population was not there anymore, and those people found employment in the rebuilding of London, and with the absence of white indentured workers, combined with the fact that life expectancy in Virginia stabilized, it now became more rational to import African slaves who will be workers for life.
Huh. Okay, wow, that seems really significant. So the opportunities of rebuilding London in 1666 kind of compelled people to stop traveling to the United States as much. And
to colonial America. Not that's one
fair.
aspect of it. The other aspect of it is other colonies are opening up, particularly in the Carolina. But it's connected to this move from white indentured labor to African slavery,
Okay,
which
cool.
has become the as the central element in American history. African slavery is the most important dimension of American history.
Okay. Okay, you get to talk about one more fire, about the Chicago fire, because that is actually a fire that I think of when I think about great fires in America. That's the only one that I think of is what happened
Okay.
really in the
Oh,
Chicago
absolutely.
fire.
Well, I thought we'll talk about the Triangle Shirt Factory fire because of its Jewish dimension. But no, I agree with you. Let's talk about the Chicago fire. And the first thing about the Chicago fire is that supposedly there's a legend that Catherine O'Leary, an Irish immigrant, was milking her cow, and her cow kicked the lantern that set the fire and burnt really much of Chicago, making over 100,000 people homeless, and so forth. It's even part of cities and stories and mythologies. Mrs. O'Leary's cow.
What year was that
Again,
fire?
pardon?
What year was that fire?
That fire was in 1871. Now, again, this obviously is a mythological story, just like the mythological story about Nero playing the Lear and not the liar, as these foreigners would pronounce it. And the Chicago fire is so important, not because of the fire itself. The fire itself was horrible, but because of the rebound that Chicago rebounded to be this great American city. My favorite. It became known as the Phoenix City, as if it rose from the dead. And it became a symbol of American resilience and American ingenuity. Because what happened is the fire destroyed everything in Chicago. But so quickly, Chicago began to reconstruct their city. They changed the material used for rebuilding to more fire resistant material, because it was, again, a wooden city, and it became the city of architectural innovation. And the beautiful Chicago that we see today, which is really beautiful.
Yeah, I do wonder, like, what would we're in the middle of this tragedy, so it's really, like, in so many ways horrible to talk about, what would a rebuilding look like, but I do wonder if you have any thoughts about, like, what would make LA a rebuilt city, and I'm happy to share mine too.
It's too early to say, but my sense is the following: that Los Angeles is a city built in the middle of the desert, and there's no real water there. And it's part of the tradition of human vanity to say to nature, fuck you, we can do whatever we want, and we don't. So the combination of the location and urban and global warming, LA has not had any rain this year. It should be a red alert that rebuilt LA should understand its place in the desert and build accordingly. And more than that, we have been drifting into weather catastrophes caused by global warming for decades. And people talk the talk, oh yeah, we need to find ways to address it, but we don't. And I don't know if the LA, maybe I'm too optimistic that the LA fire would finally convey the dramatic nature of the danger and the importance of human action on climate change. And I'm sure I'm too optimistic, but I think that's the only way this series of catastrophes in which human beings will get the message. Again, it's terrible. Human beings pay with their lives for this stupidity. What do you think?
I thought a little bit about the climate change aspect to it because it's like such a big city being impacted by a wildfire, which is different than the wildfires we've had so far. But California has so many fires. It feels like every year they have a massive fire. I don't know if that's a fact, but that's what it feels like from here in Massachusetts. I lived in LA for one summer and in Santa Monica. And if I was
In
to
I want to inform our listeners that
in a mansion,
you live in a house that is owned by my childhood friend, Ron
yes,
Zuckerman, who left for a vacation and allowed you to live there, and gave you a few cars, two of which you smashed.
yes, yes. Um, don't loan me your cars is the life lesson here.
No,
Anyways,
you have
this is actually a lesson that one of the things I think about for Los Angeles is if I was to rebuild Los Angeles and I had the opportunity to start from scratch, one of the first things that I would think about is public transit because
right,
there is no serious public transportation in Los Angeles and it's a very car reliant city. And if I was to build something from the ground up, I would think about public transit more explicitly. The other thing I think about coming from my background working in tech and AI is that the entertainment industry is really suffering. And I'm not sure if it's even like doing what it was in Los Angeles. And it just feels to be like one of these contracting industries.
right,
And when I think about Los Angeles, it feels like, kind of like a lesser city of California to San Francisco.
right.
And if
Even
there's
though
going,
it's much bigger and much more vibrant economically and so forth. But yeah, go ahead.
I have no idea that because like my world is so San Francisco oriented. Um, And I, by the way, loved Los Angeles. I think it's a beautiful place to be and live. And it was wonderful. But I do wonder if one of the things they'll think about is like, what industries do they attract and in what way as they kind of reset the industry? Does it become more like tech hub what can they do to attract some of those companies, or are they going to stick to some of the industries they are already focused in? um so that's just a thing that came to mind for me.
And I think that so I want to say a few other things about LA.
Yeah,
So you talk about the movie industry, its contraction and its struggles, um,
and
which
all
has been going
TV,
on,
all entertainment.
all entertainment. Will that affect LA's reliance on it? Um, I don't know. It's really interesting, because uh, in a way, it could be like a end of a chapter of some sort.
Right.
Uh, that LA was the entertainment industry center of the world, but as the um, entertainment industry started to
Globalize.
decentralize or to go
Mhm.
to go all over the world and different countries, different places in the states, um, that this fire would allow LA to reorient itself and diversify its economy more. Uh, that's a really interesting idea. Okay, it will show LA the potential for LA to grow from this. Um, if you ask me, this will never happen.
Mm.
The Pacific Palisades, that the area that burned, that I know, is a bunch of ritzy homes by rich people who will just rebuild ritzy homes. The
Okay.
same thing goes for public transportation. It would make so much sense instead of this incredible web of streets where you can never find parking and all these other things and traffic, to use the tragedy to create an efficient and economic and also environmentally friendly public transportation system that will wean LA of its reliance on cars that is just horrible. Fat chance.
Okay.
I don't see that. I see the people collecting the insurance and rebuilding bigger mansions and so forth until the next fire. But
Okay.
hopefully you are right and I'm wrong.
Well, this is a perfect time for us to take a break and then we'll see and we'll come back with some questions around life advice. Welcome back to all of our listeners to the Life History and Everyday Bullshit podcast, where we are now going to discuss a life advice question. This question comes from a young woman in her 30s, and she asks, how do you make time for your partner despite having kids, being busy, and having a career?
Impossible.
Okay.
I mean, um, in the ideal world, you make time for your partner and stuff like that. But the reality is that when I was in my 30s and I was working on my career and I had children, I don't remember talking to mom for years. I mean, you could do things. You can hire a babysitter and you could do romantic dinners and stuff like that. And I suppose that's very nice. But the reality that I remember is being exhausted. The person who's asking the question, the young woman, um, she's absolutely right. We should make time for our partners, and uh, we need to make sure that the relationship continues to work, because if we don't, and the relationship breaks down, then it's a catastrophe for on a personal level, and really a challenge for the children and stuff like that. It's not that divorce is the end of the world, but it's better not to get divorced if you can avoid it. And so, can you keep the intimacy and the love? And but I think what is important here in this question is the expectation. The expectation that you can have passion and love and intimacy while you're trying to develop career-wise, and while you are running like a chicken without a head after young children who really don't give a shit about your relationship to your partner, and uh, would do all they can to destroy as much of your life as they possibly can.
That's my
They,
kids, yes.
they would wake you up at early in the morning, and putting them to bed usually means that you fall asleep with them. So when do you make time?
I have a question for you, for our
Yeah.
listeners, and for myself. I'm curious, do you think there is a different expectation on like partnership right now for millennials than there was for boomers like yourself, around like, is the were like when you were in your 30s, were people saying like, and take care of yourself and self-care and your partner and da 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 da? Or
No,
is that like a modern thing? Okay.
it's a modern thing. It's partly because of the way us boomers raised you guys in the very bad way, because we made you the center of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And my parents would, go to see their friends at night. And they didn't play with us. They kind of said, go play. And we did. Now, of course, different times, it's not, you can't really do it today, send kids into the streets for a variety of reasons. But we thought that our parents neglected us, and we thought that we're going to do better, and because we love our children a lot more than our parents loved us. And so when we raised you, we did everything. We took you to a violin lesson and to a chess club, and to develop your soccer skills. We, with our excessive parenting, undermined you and made you miserable, because you're sitting there in your 30s and you say, I don't feel very meaningful. What do you think?
Well, and then now, whether you feel that or not, then you're married to someone that spent their whole life being the center of their parents' attention and wants that
Absolutely.
attention from their partner
Right.
as well. Yeah. I think that I'm not an expert in this matter, but
Unlike me, as you know, I spent years studying it. Yes.
yeah. I do think that our generation does a better job, hopefully, of not just doing everything for our kids, although I'm not sure that's true, but there is this theme of like self-care, worry about yourself. And so I think part of worrying about yourself is also worrying about your partner. And I think that there is no answer, but what I will say is that I have read that people are least happy in their marriage when they have a kid from the age of 0 to 2, and then it gets a little bit better, and then it gets a lot better after a kid is 18 or something like that.
That's
So,
horrible.
so I wonder if some of it is just time and reminding yourself that when your kids are under 2 or 3 or what, 4, whatever it is, for my experience 5, that it's harder. And that kids get a little bit easier and a little bit more self-sufficient. And part of me, I wonder sometimes, is like, is this about your partner, or is this question also about your own self-growth and finding things for yourself, and the intermix between when you do things for yourself and the guilt of doing things for yourself? Because I think while our generation does do things for ourselves, a lot of times we feel guilty when we do, like it's wrong.
Yeah, so did we. Yeah, and I'm surprised I didn't say in the beginning. The only way of doing it is living close to family. That the modern family, in which people don't live near one another, makes us all lonelier and doesn't provide us with the support that we need at all times. So when you have small children, if you live near family, there are people you can turn to.
Yeah.
Equally, when you are older and you live near family, there's support near you. But the way our life works out these days is everybody, even people who live nearby, supposedly like you and I, are 2 hours apart, away, or 2.5 hours away. It's just not. You can't drop the kids and say, Rafi and I want to go and have some time on our own. It's just not. It's just not possible, and that's really part of the story. You know, this idea that you just live alone, that it's all about your career, personal development. That's the other consequence of it, that you don't live near family.
Okay, interesting. Okay, Abba, thank you very much. This was a lovely podcast.
Bye-bye.
Have a great night. Goodbye.
You too.
Thank you for listening to Life, History, and Everyday Bullshtick. If you're enjoying this podcast, please subscribe, tell a friend, and maybe even leave us a review. You can email us at info@bullshtick.com. This podcast was edited and produced by me, Heddy Ben-Atar. See you next week.